Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you again. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the managing partner of the Olmsted 200 campaign. Can you believe it? We're just a month away from Olmsted's 200th birthday. But no worries, this is a year-long celebration, and we look forward to providing provocative and inspiring conversations throughout 2022. We invite everyone to participate in the vast array of programs, tours, and conferences happening from coast to coast. Please visit olmsted200.org to learn more and to watch our ever-changing calendar and blog. Our gala in New York City is nearly sold out, but we are not stopping there. In June, we'll head west to Chicago, where we will celebrate Olmsted in Henry Hobson Richardson's landmark Glessner House, followed by tours of Chicago parks with historian Julia Bachrach. Watch for our online invitation to be released on Monday. Today, we're going to continue our examination of the evolution of Olmsted's thinking about parks for all people. In our first conversation, Visions for Reform, we explored Olmsted's trip into the pre-Civil War South as a roving reporter for the New York Daily Times. During that time, he examined plantation life, slavery, and the Southern economy, and began to shape a vision of landscape design and social reform. Today, we're going to jump ahead a few years to 1863. In 1863, Olmsted leaves his post as the first executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission in D.C. and heads west for the first time, all the way to the Sierra Madres, where he will be responsible for running the Mariposa gold mine. Of course, Yosemite and the Mariposa Big Tree Grove are in his backyard, and he and his family find this new and sublime scenery. As luck would have it, the state of California is also seeking advice on how to manage the Yosemite and Big Tree Grove, which has just been granted to the state by the feds. And Olmsted is selected to chair a commission to make this report. We certainly think of Olmsted as an urban park maker. But did you know, decades earlier, Olmsted was calling for great public grounds for the enjoyment of the people as a duty of government. In this bicentennial year, Olmsted 200 is delighted to showcase new research and thoughtful examination of Olmsted's life, work, and legacy. And today we're happy to zero in on a new book, Olmsted and Yosemite. We will explore Olmsted's trip west and the content of the report he crafted to provide the state government with advice on the management of the first scenic reservation set aside in perpetuity for the American people. Was the report suppressed? Why is Olmsted's role just now being understood? Stay tuned for discussion. Olmsted and Yosemite, this new book, lays claim to setting the historical record straight by offering a new interpretation of how the American park came to figure so prominently in our cultural identity. It is just one of many wonderful books being issued this year by Celebration partner Library of American Landscape History and other publishers. I urge you to visit our website and its blog, Shared Spaces, where you will find an article, Olmsted, a Reading List, connecting you to the many releases for adults and children, including a new 3-hour course on Audible, The Enduring Genius of Frederick Law Olmsted, due out on April 21st. To take us on our exploration today, we are joined by 3 scholars. Our moderator, back from the first conversation, Sara Zewde, principal with Studio Zewde and currently assistant professor in practice at Harvard University. Sara was named an Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation and listed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation on its inaugural 40 Under 40 People Saving Places list. We are pleased that she is a member of the Olmsted 200 Honorary Committee. Joining her are the co-authors of the book, which gives us the title for this conversation, Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea. We welcome Ethan Carr and Rolf Diamant. Ethan is a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, an editor of the Olmsted Papers, and a prolific and thoughtful scholar on the American landscape. Next year, we will bring Ethan back to discuss a book coming out in 2023, Boston's Franklin Park, Olmsted, Recreation, and the Modern City. Joining him is Rolf, who is the former superintendent of the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site and currently adjunct associate professor at the University of Vermont. During his work with the National Park Service, Rolf expanded its conservation portfolio to include wild and scenic rivers, state parks, and national heritage areas. Both are former board members of the National Association for Olmsted Parks. The two authors will start off the conversation outlining the findings in their book and providing us some visual and historical context. Sara will then offer some observations and questions and encourage questions from those of you listening today. Please let us know where you are from in the chat box, but submit any questions you have through the Q&A box. With that, let me turn it over to Ethan and Rolf.
Thank you very much, Dee Dee. Rolf and I are going to briefly introduce our book, and I will start, but we'll try to keep our comments to a minimum so we can have a maximum discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I start rolling with the slides, Rolf?
Go forward.
Okay. Well, we're all here to discuss this book, which I would describe as a reinterpretation of the origins of the national park idea, as Dee Dee was alluding to. So the question is, where did the idea for creating a system of national parks come from? And there are lots of explanations. If you don't believe me, just Google it. You will find many theories about where the idea for national parks came from. Did it arise spontaneously in 1870 around a campfire in Yellowstone? That was the official story at the Park Service until really quite recently, although we've known it's untrue since at least the 1960s. And as Dee Dee was saying, doesn't it have something to do with Teddy Roosevelt or John Muir? Well, in 1864, when Lincoln signed the Yosemite grant, Teddy Roosevelt was a child, and Muir was still working in a factory in Indianapolis, so I don't think that story holds up either. But a lot of people would still ask, why are we talking about Frederick Law Olmsted? He was a park designer, right? Urban parks, starting with Central Park in 1858. What does that have to do with national parks? Aren't they very different? Well, so I'll start by observing the term national park idea in our title is a bit misleading, because what we're really here to talk about is the public park idea as it took shape in the mid-19th century, at least in the United States. And we're suggesting that the source of the US national park idea was in fact this broader idea of public parks in the mid-19th century. And so our goal in the book was to put the establishment of Yosemite Valley as a public park into the historical context of the great issues of the day. And there were some great issues: the Civil War, abolition, Reconstruction, and others. And so what we hope to do with that context is answer the question of what Olmsted does have to do with Yosemite Valley and with the origins of the national park idea. How and why a park was created at Yosemite in 1864 has a lot to do with what Olmsted was doing at the same time at Central Park. It has a lot to do with his anti-slavery activism, with his service in the Civil War, and more generally with his ideas as a public intellectual and a social theorist of the day. And it was a really important period to be a public intellectual and a social theorist. A lot was going on. This quotation is from a letter from Sara that Sara Shaw wrote to Olmsted in 1861, and it was a starting point for us. Shaw was a well-known Bostonian abolitionist, social reformer, philanthropist. She was also the mother of Robert Gould Shaw, who was killed 2 years later in South Carolina, along with over 100 Black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And she captured a remarkable moment in this letter: an identification of an unprecedented public park with the abolition of slavery and the remaking of the Republic at this critical time, just as the nation was sliding into war. And it was during this tumultuous period that the idea of the public park, both municipal and national, became established as a new public institution in the US, both in the country's largest city and in the remote Sierra Nevada of California. And by 1864, when Congress makes the Yosemite grant and Lincoln signs it, both of these public parks embodied many of the values and the aspirations that Olmsted and Sara Shaw and many others held for what a remade republic could be, in contrast to what it had been before the war. And yes, they are in dramatically different settings, these two different places, different circumstances, as we see here, to put it mildly. These are indeed very different places. But in our book, we're really examining what both Central Park and Yosemite Valley had in common, without ignoring their differences. And first, I would point to their purpose, as it was described and understood then, which may not be exactly how we might characterize it now, but both were acquired and developed for the general public to enjoy the benefits of experiences of landscape beauty that otherwise would not be readily available to them. And that may sound superficial to us today, but it wasn't. We can talk more about that, but I would say it still isn't. Those benefits were considered real. They were even necessary for individual and public health, both physical and emotional. Therefore, it was a duty of responsible government to make sure that everyone could have these benefits, because otherwise the privileged few only would enjoy them, even monopolize them, to the detriment of everyone else, and therefore to the detriment of society as a whole. But of course, not really everyone was going to benefit. The people being, we can say the public, but that's not everyone. The people being dispossessed and evicted in order to make these places public parks were not benefiting, obviously. And this is unfortunately another shared characteristic of these two very different in many ways places, and that is dispossession of the free Black community located on the Central Park site, of the indigenous people that had made Yosemite their home for thousands of years. At the time, dispossession was justified in the name of public interest, a public interest doctrine. But who were the public? Not everyone, and not then, and not now, arguably. Nevertheless, the assertion of a public benefit, and in fact, of a necessity for societal well-being, was being asserted, as it was for other public works that involved eminent domain, such as water projects, sewers, etc. Parks were considered, and perhaps still are, another subject for discussion, public health infrastructure, in other words, so there was an identified public interest that justified the use of eminent domain and dispossession. Second, I would point to these two places and say they have shared common meanings in the mid-19th century. They both emerged out of the conflict, the activism, the rhetoric of the 1850s and 60s, and they both embodied some of the aspirations for a remade nation. What would that be? Well, first of all, a republic without enslaved people, one that preserved the Union, allowed the Union to assume a better form, a republic that was still very imperfect, but at least moved towards the still unattained ideals that it had been founded on. And I would describe that as the basic ideology of the new Republican Party that had gotten Lincoln elected. And this really may be our main point. This institution, the public park, emerged at this time because of the war, because of the social upheaval around it, and not in spite of those things. Historians have noted that many new American institutions came out of this period of conflict, as did a reforged national identity. And when we see the national park together with the urban park as one of these new institutions, as part of new foundations of national identity, from this period, we can begin to understand how these places did come to figure so largely in the national consciousness. It makes more sense if we understand the origins of these places coming out of the cauldron of civil war and the new institutions that were being formed following that war. There was a real question, though, whether a democratic form of government could successfully create places like Central Park or Yosemite Valley as public parks. In Europe, urban parks have been mostly former aristocratic holdings, gradually open to the public. Here, they would have to be created by our own often chaotic democracy. And many expected the results to be a disaster. Public landscapes would be taken over by the unruly mobs that many still associated with representative democracy. Remember, this is, the failed Republican revolutions in Europe of 1848 were still fresh in the minds of many people. The idea of a more representative government was still very questionable. Monarchists in Europe violently suppressed republicanism. And of course, in the United States, half of our own republic was quite intent to putting an end to our own experiment in republicanism, the oldest, that began in 1776. And so the creation of a great public park like this in the largest city of the American Republic was actually a radical political act because this was a northern vision of the Republic's future, characterized by increasingly urban, industrial, diverse cities. Could those cities be healthful? Could they be survivable? If they were not, then the northern vision for the nation was untenable. The image of unhealthy, chaotic, ungovernable cities in the North was great propaganda for the South leading up to the Civil War. How can you condemn our plantations, in other words, when your cities are so awful? They are even worse. Images like this one that we see here of a popular, beautiful public park were a direct rebuttal. The popular success of Central Park was proof that the northern vision of an urban future was tenable. This was not a society drifting into chaos and dysfunction. It could do this. As Central Park was, as Calvert Vaux said, the big artwork of the Republic, or as the Atlantic Monthly editorialized in this quotation, it was nothing less than a profoundly effective defense and vindication of self-government. So let's also consider this idea of the experience of landscape beauty, easy to dismiss today as dated, romantic, elitist, ethnocentric, all of the above, and it has been. But I would suggest that what Olmsted is describing in aesthetic terms could be described today as the importance of experiencing nature, of biophilia, or simply the need of all people to experience the natural world in order to maintain physical and emotional health. We use terms now like nature deficit disorder. We point to things like the obesity epidemic and other public health issues to emphasize the vital importance of these kinds of experiences. And so whatever the language or terms used, I think recent social science and medical research seem to confirm what 19th century park makers were onto. And Olmsted wanted to make sure that what he might call the experience of landscape beauty was available to everyone, or at least the public, wherever they were, an evolving term, to put it mildly, and not just to the few who could go to the Catskills each summer. A public park could be available to all. And no, this goal was not fully realized for all people, not the people who were displaced to make parks, not for many who found parks to be too distant or simply off-putting socially, or who were discriminated against until really quite recently, but to a remarkable degree, perhaps, they continue to be considered vital to public health. And so when Olmsted finds himself in Mariposa, California, near Yosemite in 1864, it's not hard to imagine why the State Park Commission, created to receive the Yosemite grant for the purpose of making the valley into a public park, would decide to make use of his experience at Central Park, his ideas, and his serendipitous proximity. He happened to be right there to produce a report to guide how this place would become a public park. And the purpose of this new park and the justifications for government to act in making it, as Olmsted described them, were entirely consistent with what he had described for Central Park just a few years earlier. Two great icons of the American landscape, Central Park and Yosemite Valley, have some very important things in common that transcend their differences. Olmsted summarized this American park ideology in his 1865 report, which is reprinted as part of our book. He provided the justifications, the reasons for government's involvement, the hoped for benefits, not just for Yosemite, but really for public parks generally. It's an intellectual framework for a national park system, and in fact, for the American park movement generally, that would see parks created at every level of government, from towns and cities to regions and states, and yes, at the federal level. And I'll just end by saying, although the report did not become the basis for the development of Yosemite Valley, it was not lost either. Rolf will be picking up the story of how Frederick Olmsted Jr., for example, used these ideas and this text when drafting key portions of the 1916 legislation that defined the purposes of national parks in the United States.
Thank you, Ethan. I'd like to now talk about the wider context of the Yosemite grant. At the time, a modest but very consequential component of a much larger program of wartime legislative reforms that fundamentally changed America. These reforms, though imperfect and incomplete, all sought to redefine and broaden the responsibilities of government and to expand the rights and privileges of American citizens. This transformation, as Ethan emphasized, was predicated on defeating the Southern Rebellion and destroying the vast system of slavery that it tried to protect. Before the Civil War, Southern elites and their political allies effectively blocked land grants for education, transportation, and homesteading. They were content with a weak central government with limited responsibilities, primarily collecting port duties, delivering the US mail, protecting settlers on the frontier, and pursuing fugitive slaves. And they preferred financing that government through the sale of public land in lieu of personal taxes, thus avoiding taxation on the enormous wealth accumulated through enslaved labor. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead to the second year of the Civil War, a war that was becoming, in the words of President Lincoln, a remorseless and revolutionary struggle. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people self-emancipated, seeking freedom and sanctuary behind Union lines. Olmsted clearly understood, as he wrote in 1861 in the New York Times, that Black resistance and self-emancipation in large numbers would hollow out the Confederacy and accelerate its collapse. This great movement of freed people and their new alliance with the Federal Army would place enormous pressure on the Lincoln administration to advance its own emancipation plans. Early in the war, for most Northern loyalists, ending the rebellion and reestablishing the Union were paramount objectives. The goal now was no longer the restoration of the federal union, the old federal union as it was, but replacing it, as Sara Shaw had hoped, with something better. When it became clear there would be no negotiated peace settlement returning the country to its pre-war status quo, rapid changes began to happen. The Republican-dominated Congress, without the presence of Southern Democrats, now set about replacing laws and policies that had primarily served the interests of those profiting from slavery. Congress sought to build a more activist republic, focused on improvements, serving broader constituencies. And within a period of 5 months, actually, from March to July 1862, it passed legislation in this compressed period for a national banking and revenue system, a Department of Agriculture, public education, transportation, and homesteading. The Civil War, in Lincoln's view, was a people's contest, and government should exist to help the people. At the same time, Congress struck down slavery, first in the District of Columbia, then in all the Western territories of the United States, and finally in all the property and lands controlled by the Union Army. The capstone to all of this was congressional authorization for the recruitment of Black soldiers. Truly a revolutionary act, followed almost immediately by Lincoln's release of his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In June 1864, Lincoln signed the act granting Yosemite Valley to the state of California for use as a public park, as Olmsted would describe, in trust for the whole nation. As Ethan said, the Yosemite Act drew its inspiration from New York's Central Park, exemplifying a commitment to public health and well-being. And near the end of the war, relocated to California, Olmsted was asked to write a report intended to guide the future management of Yosemite Valley. But he took this opportunity to also share a vision for a reconstructed post-war nation, where great public parks were keystone institutions of a renewed American democracy. In the photo on the right, is a picture of victorious Union soldiers parading in the final Grand Review in May 1865 down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue. Ethan and I really want to emphasize that without this Union victory, aided by the mobilization of nearly 200,000 Black soldiers, legislation for Yosemite, the template for the early national parks that followed, might never have been enacted. In other words, if the Yosemite grant had been proposed just say a few years earlier in a pre-war Congress, it would have no doubt shared the same fate as other bottled up Republican initiatives that had been defeated or vetoed. In the Yosemite Report, Olmsted affirmed every person's entitlement to enjoy the nation's most spectacular landscapes and recognized the explicit responsibility of government to make that happen. In the process, as Ethan described, Olmsted framed the intellectual foundation for a system of national parks, declaring the establishment of government of these great public grounds for the free enjoyment of the people is thus justified as a political duty. Olmsted believed that government had a compelling obligation to support these great public parks on an equal footing with all its other major duties. It needs to be repeated again. If the park symbolized a commitment to public well-being, that public did not include everyone in mid-19th century America. The establishment of a park in Yosemite Valley would follow the dispossession a decade earlier of the valley's native population. Indigenous peoples were never included among the beneficiaries of Lincoln's new birth of freedom, as they were forced out of ancestral lands repurposed to expedite Republican land policies. Early writers who describe Yosemite Valley as untrammeled wild nature willfully overlook countless generations of human occupation. There is no record that we found of Olmsted's reply to Sara Shaw's letter, but they shared a similar vision, no doubt. In the Yosemite Report, Olmsted specifically identified continuing work at Central Park, along with the construction of the Capitol Dome in Washington and the establishment of a public park in Yosemite Valley as projects affirming the efficacy of Republican government and the necessity of defending it. Early historians have been at a loss to explain the Yosemite Act, considering its wartime passage an unexplained anomaly, a great mystery. They could not comprehend why Congress would take time out of its schedule of wartime emergencies to deal with something like Yosemite. Quite to the contrary, Ethan and I placed the Yosemite Act in the larger framework of wartime legislative and constitutional reform. In fact, as Lincoln believed, if an insurrection could interfere with the functioning and continuity of constitutional government, quote, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us. Throughout most of its history, the National Park Service has been reluctant for any number of reasons to recognize the crucial role the Civil War and Reconstruction played in the early history of national parks, including the establishment of Yellowstone in 1872. Yellowstone's authorization was concurrent with a rising tide of federal authority, a byproduct of the war that was further extended by efforts to enforce Southern Reconstruction and the adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the US Constitution. However, early National Park Service leaders and publicists were content with inventing national park origin stories unburdened by any reference to the Civil War, emancipation, urban parks, Olmsted, or for that matter, the 1865 Yosemite Report. The imagery of pristine, uninhabited Western landscapes reimagined as national parks by either explorers or famous conservationists such as John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt served very well as comfortable and affirming narratives. Olmsted was too closely identified with Central Park when the new parks were being marketed as a concept born in the rugged West, not the urban East. Olmsted was also too closely associated with his books that strongly condemned slavery in the Old South, when the Civil War was being widely reinterpreted through the lens of the lost cause. Reconstruction between North and South was becoming a national obsession, illustrated in this photograph of veterans shaking hands at the 1913 Gettysburg Peace Jubilee. All across the nation, Jim Crow and segregation were ascendant. The film Birth of a Nation was screened in the White House in 1915. That's just a year before the National Park Service was established. The photo on the right shows Horace Albright and Stephen Mather, leaders of the new agency, in front of their touring car. In the 1920s, when new national parks were being established in the South, such as Shenandoah National Park, there were segregated public facilities. Even the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial had segregated seating for attendees. However, the Yosemite Report was never forgotten. Its influence on national parks lived on through Olmsted's son and namesake, who drafted key sections of the 1916 legislation creating the National Park Service. The goals and purposes of national parks that Olmsted Jr. so famously described were based on many ideas his father had advocated some 50 years earlier. So why do we need to deal with this now? It is time we tell a refreshed, more inclusive history of national parks. The 1865 Yosemite Report can still be interpreted today as a caution against private monopolization and exploitation of public lands. It can also be represented as a timeless appeal for equitable public access to special places and an unambiguous recognition of government's immutable responsibility for park stewardship, now and hopefully forever. Sara?
Thank you so much, Rolf and Ethan, for a really taste of the incredible conversation and arguments that you've laid out in the book, which was a pleasure to read, and I gained and learned so much from it. You know, one of the most important contributions in my mind of this work is the contextualization of the historical events leading up to, and in fact, during the Civil War. Olmsted is born, as we know, in 1822, and he writes the Yosemite Report in 1865. And that roughly 40-year period coincides with the 40-year cotton boom that reshapes the American economy and position in global geopolitics. And so, you know, Olmsted comes of age in the middle of the swirl of this cotton boom, and arguably this cotton boom culminates in both a Civil War and a national park idea. It's been said that landscape architects place too much value and significance on Central Park, but I'm delighted to see you all reinforce it actually and expand the significance of Central Park, triangulating it with geographies across the country. And so I'd like to kind of kick off the conversation with you all by returning to that. So much of how you frame this, Olmsted's work throughout his career, is by returning to Central Park, returning to 1861, and using that as a lens on his later work and his work across the country. Are we placing too much significance on Central Park, or was it really? Can we really see it as a proving ground for his career and for the national park idea?
Should I go, Rolf?
Go ahead.
I also, thank you, Sara. I also like to respond to a comment I saw in the chat saying, what about Boston Common? I mean, that's 1634, right? You know, or whatever. Well, Boston Common, I say to the chatter, is a common, not a park, first of all. It was sort of turned into a municipal park in the 19th century. But the real significance of Central Park is that government acted in 1851, a municipal government, to create a park on a scale that was unprecedented in the United States and had unprecedented purpose. It was an unprecedented public work. Yes, it did involve eminent domain and the dislocations of people both who owned property and who didn't own property on the site. So it was the beginning of something, is what I'm trying to get to. As a park project, it was unprecedented, and it was immediately picked up upon and repeated in many other cities, so that it really was the beginning of something. And I don't think we are putting too much emphasis on Central Park. And part of the reason I say that is because it happens during those years sliding into the Civil War. And so the symbolism and the meaning of this public project was inevitably going to be enlarged. And it was, the great artwork of the Republic, et cetera. And also because of what then happens at Yosemite Valley, which is, the Yosemite Grant is made while Central Park is still under construction in 1864. And they both have remained these sort of, as I said, icons on either coast in very different contexts of something, right? And what that is, we can resort to phrases like, oh, the public park and the American imagination or whatever, but it makes sense when you look at Central Park and Yosemite and the period they're coming out of, as they are part of a new institution that is formed. And so that's really the significance of Central Park for me, is that there is this important new institution. It's not without fault, it's not without flaws. It's complex. There are economic interests at stake, real estate interests, tourism interests, but this new public institution is being created and that helps explain why both remain very large in the public imagination, if I can use that phrase, or because they were part of the reframing of American identities, plural, in the years following the Civil War. So I don't think so, Sarah. I think that obviously we wrote this book. It's really about Central Park and Yosemite. we're not going to say we're overemphasizing their importance.
I just may add one thing too, Sarah. The Central Park represented at the time one of the largest civic investments, public works projects in the country, at a time when, number one, the federal government was shying away from national improvements. And also, in the South, in Olmsted, you've written about this and spoken about this, Olmsted's observations and his travels through the South, clearly he saw that capital was being reinvested in the slave system and not in the infrastructure of the Commonwealth. So, Central Park sort of stands out in contrast to that.
And at a time when federal public works, as you've pointed out, Rolf, were being stopped by Southern Democrats in Congress. So the idea of this kind of public work being undertaken by a municipal government saying, no, look, you can do this. We can do great things. We can rebuild, we can reinvent the Republic through great public works. That's all of those things Central Park meant during those critical years. It's the competition, the initial construction, and boom, Fort Sumter. It's like slides right into the war.
How is it that we've, in the historicization of the national park idea, of landscape architecture's profession, and even in understanding Olmsted's legacy, how have we decoupled all of these accomplishments and this chronology from the historical events that clearly shaped Olmsted's practice?
Go ahead, Rolf. I think it's yours.
Well, they have been decoupled, and how did that happen? I think it's the way we look at, public memory tends to compartmentalize people. You've spoken about this, Sarah. This is part of the problem with looking at people's lives in chapters. And if you don't look at this greater context, you lose the connections.
You both in your presentations inserted some disclaimers about the relationship between this history and that of land disposition, and both African American people, but also indigenous people, especially at Yosemite. Could you speak a little bit more about what Olmsted said, thought, what's been documented about his relationship to the question of land dispossession, displacement, and particularly in the context of his recommendations?
I just have to say there isn't a lot of reference to Native peoples in Olmsted's report. I mean, they're just a little bit beyond the rim of his world, and if you read through it, I mean, he's certainly aware of them, but that's his blind spot. Absolutely, he just doesn't take into account, and it's misleading. It actually misleads him a bit, because he writes about the meadows of Yosemite. He compares them to the River Avon, and his visits to England earlier reminds him of the English countryside. And of course, these meadows were the result of burning. Deliberate burning by the Miwok people who lived there for a long period of time. So he's blinded here, and there's just no other way to put it. And it's a major blind spot.
And it's an irony because, of course, as you're saying, Rolf, the character of the Yosemite landscape, it was a cultural landscape, been inhabited and managed for thousands of years, and no one understood that. And so the first thing they do when the military drive out the Miwok and discover, so to speak, Yosemite Valley, is complain about these people just light it on fire all the time. They have no idea how to preserve a landscape, right? And so there's tremendous irony that they repress the burning, and immediately it starts reforesting, and views start to be lost. You have about half of the open space in Yosemite Valley now that you had in the 1850s. And it becomes a controversy because the concessioners want those views, start cutting down trees. And so they go to Olmsted in the 1880s and say, what should we do about this? We have to stop these vandals from cutting down trees. And Olmsted sort of demurred. He said, actually, sometimes you do have to cut down trees, but doesn't get involved. And he stays uninvolved with the Yosemite later in his life, really on purpose, because these kinds of controversies he didn't feel he was going to be able to resolve. I was just laughing also because when you asked the question about why we disassociate Olmsted from this story, and why the story of the Civil War in that context isn't more understood as the origin of the national park idea, that Rolf and I have been dealing with this our entire professional lives. This is and at Fairstead and at earlier books and so on, we've been talking about why doesn't anyone recognize how national parks and municipal parks are not parts of two different movements? It's part of one movement. It's about public parks, and it comes out of the mid-19th century. It's not something that suddenly comes to life in 1916 with the National Park Service, or 1903 when Muir and Teddy Roosevelt get together and fall in love around a campfire. And I'm not saying that facetiously. That's what Muir said. Or 1870, even at the Yellowstone campfire. It's clear where this idea comes from. It's sort of it always has been. It's just you can't separate national and municipal parks the way we like to do, as Rolf was describing. It's because urban parks are urban and eastern, and all of those things that by the early 20th century, the National Park Service and others wanted national parks to be something different, pristine, Western. And it has to be added, it was a white middle-class vision. The vision of national parks in the early 20th century was very much about a white middle-class public, and this mythology of the pristine West. And so all of those things, Sara, lead to that separation, in my opinion, and are very problematic now.
It was marketing to some extent.
Yeah, and early 20th century marketing. Remember what we're talking about in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
As
They
far
didn't
as
want to
racial and social
national
realities.
parks.
It's just really problematic to be continuing that kind of history at this point in American history, when the National Park Service is dedicated to the idea of increasing diversity, increasing ownership of the national park system, right, through it out a more diverse public. We can't cling to early 20th century stories because they come out of an era that was very different from from our era and what we are trying to do now.
I mean, I can imagine that, telling the full history or an expanded history of the origin story of these parks, and how at the very origin is the idea of a union, a post-bellum society, that the inclusive history of it could potentially lead to an inclusive future, that is a way to bring people into the image of the national park.
Well stated. I mean, that's part of one of the reasons for writing this book, is to retell that story, because it is a more inclusive story, and link it to emancipation. There's no question that this would have had a different outcome if that war had been lost and if we were still a slave republic. There would have been little appetite for these great national parks out west or anywhere else. Not for a long time, at least.
And I will say, if you look at how the National Park Service celebrated its centennial, what its stated goals are: find your park, increasing the ownership of the national park system among a much broader public than you currently are seeing in too much of the national park system, that the intention is there. It's very much the intention that parks need to have more diverse visitors, right? All of that. But what hasn't been there is a recognition that, okay, if that's your intention, how are you telling the story of national parks? Because you're still telling them the story about Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir is still there on the website. And it's a problem because that story doesn't really support current intentions.
The National Park Service does an excellent job in a couple of places in telling, particularly Yosemite, in telling the story of the Buffalo Soldiers and their role in policing the national parks and running the national parks for a long period of time in the late 19th century. But it isn't a huge stretch to connect those Buffalo Soldiers right back to the US colored troops. And the story of the war and how important it was for African-American citizenship to serve in the United States Army. That's a big story. That's a major connection that could be made.
Among the lessons to learn from this history is Olmsted's role as an advocate, and you include a complete transcription of the report in your book. And so I wonder if you both could speak to the role of government that Olmsted was advocating for, particularly in the role of ensuring access to parks for all people. How are we doing? What report, what kind of grade do you think Olmsted would give us today? How much of what he's saying and advocating for are we living, and how much can we still be advocating for relative to the ways in which he was speaking about the role of government in the mid-19th century?
Well, you got to give Olmsted, you have to look at it as aspirational rhetoric. He believed in it, but it was clear that this was a idea that would take, that is still a work in progress today. I don't know what grade if you gave the government a grade over the last 160 years, it would not be a very good grade. But it's clearly he set the bar. And the value of the report today is that we're still working to reach it, to get over it. And that he understood, at least in theoretical terms, rhetorical terms, how central this was to the park philosophy he was espousing.
I've just run through some of the comments while Rolf was in. I just want to acknowledge to the people writing comments, there are some awesome comments in the chat that I can't possibly respond to all of them, but they're very interesting comments that our audience is flinging at us. Some of whom say hello, and I should say hello back. But as far as the role of government, Rolf, you also talk about how that the institution of public parks was part of an expanded role of government, and that there are many other dimensions to that. But this idea of an expanded role of government, including the institution of public parks, I think is pretty fundamental, because we've lost that somewhere along the line. You know, some things we've gotten closer to achieving, and some things we actually have moved away from. And the idea that public parks are a public institution to be funded by general taxation and are essential to the well-being of society isn't one of the ones we've been losing steadily over the last 30 years, because we've instead said, no, actually public parks are just for the people who enjoy them, and they should pay for them through public nonprofit partnerships, through fundraising, through entrance fees, and so on. And so this idea, if they're that important, if they are essential to public well-being and individual well-being, clearly they should be, like a lot of other things, funded by government. But we seem to have backed off from that bit of the rhetoric of 19th century, you know, and I just like to point that out, that losing that has been a backward development, whereas sometimes we move forward, sometimes we move backward.
Yeah, this, as Ethan describes it, this is the age-old battle of federalism. What is the appropriate role of the national government? What is the appropriate role of state governments? And the importance of the Yosemite Report is that here you have Olmsted, he's really a chronicler of his times. He is writing about in real time what the Union victory in his perspective, what does that mean for the future of federalism, of the relationship of the national government to the states, and his vision of the expanded responsibility of government to provide certain basic services and rights, to guarantee those rights to all Americans. I mean, this is going on. He's writing this on the cusp of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, equal protection under the law, and and suffrage, black male suffrage in the 15th Amendment. He is looking at the world around him. But this battle, as we know, you know, from the current struggle over voting rights, it's far from resolved.
Well, Ethan, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, but also for the work that you've contributed to our understanding of this history through your book. We have about 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to give you both a moment to, you know, share any final thoughts or conclusions before we close out.
I'm tempted to respond to some of the pointed questions that are coming over the chat box, because some of them I feel I can respond quite effectively to. But Rolf, you should start.
Well, I was just going to emphasize that, you know, we tend to use public memory to interpret people's lives as a sequential narrative with very discrete chapters. And Olmsted's life just defied that kind of compartmentalization. As both you, Sara, and Ethan have pointed out, Olmsted never really pivoted from being a farmer to being a journalist, or for being an anti-slavery writer to being a park designer, or wartime administrator to a landscape architect. His peripatetic activities all overlapped. They were all guided by a consistent thread of social activism. And that's really one of the main points of our book. His strong views on human improvement, particularly his steadfast antagonism to slavery, were really his North Star.
Yeah, and the two great issues of the day for Olmsted were first, abolition and the victory of the Union, and second, establishing the institution of the public park in America. And it just to further reinforce what you're saying, Rolf, there's one person, and there's one set of values there. These aren't two different sides of these were totally of a piece, and he was doing both in his career. Now the civil rights side starts to wane after 1881, let's say, when he moves to Brookline, and his practice, he's got in his 60s and his practice is taking off, and he's really concentrating on building his practice, especially so he can pass it on to his stepson and son as his major legacy. But the idea of basically civil rights activism, if we can put it that way, or in general activism, social activism, and the institution of the public park are both part and parcel of what his career is. They're not two separate things. Parks were a means to an end. You know, he didn't design parks so that he could be just feel that, oh, I'm a great artist and this is a beautiful landscape. He did that also, but they were a means to an end. And the end was the improvement of society, that's sort of in the DNA of the practice that he establishes, and with Calvert Vaux names landscape architecture. So when students sometimes tell me, oh, I'm not that interested in landscape architecture, I want to be an activist, I say, well, of all the design professions, you probably chose the right one.
Thank you both. I'll hand it over to Dee Dee to close us out.
I want to just say thank you so much to our fantastic contributors today. Obviously, there are lots of questions yet to be answered in the chat box and out of it. And I hope you all will go to the Olmsted 200 calendar. You will be able to see Rolf and Ethan at the conference in Boston being sponsored by the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site later this month. And there are opportunities in Atlanta and elsewhere where you can continue this conversation. And I hope you also will save the date, May 23, for our next conversation with Olmsted. This one will explore Olmsted and the writing life. We will have with us Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Geraldine Brooks, Nation magazine publisher Katrina vanden Heuvel, a magazine founded by Olmsted, as well as James Barron, reporter from the New York Times, where, as we know from our conversation today, Olmsted was a roving reporter. So please check out our website, olmsted200.org, and on April 26th, the birthday, please use the hashtag Celebrate Olmsted and spread the word about this important anniversary on social media. In the spirit of this conversation, I'm happy to report that Niagara Falls will light up on Olmsted's birthday in recognition of his remarkable conservation legacy. So I want to thank everyone again. Until we meet in May, enjoy Olmsted's birthday, and thanks for attending today.